Welcome to this video. Today we'll talk about the state-dependent interaction model. We will start with an introduction and then the step of developing the state-dependent model, and then we take an example as a case study and see how we can apply the step of the model on this example. So let's get started. Previously, we talked about something we call it is stateless dependent interaction model, and today we have the state dependence. So in stateless dependent interaction model, we built a model to show the interaction between the objects of the system. We in that model we determines all the objects of the system, the boundary objects, the control objects, and other type of objects. In that system or in that model, we use a sequence diagram and communication diagram to model the system. In the stateless dependent interaction model, we describe the interaction between the objects by using sequence and communication diagram. Here we will use the same. We will describe the interaction between the objects of the system using sequence diagram and communication diagram. So what the difference between the stateless dependent and state dependent interaction model? Actually, as I mentioned, uh, the step of one of the step of modeling the system using stateless dependent interaction model is determine the object of the system. We determine the boundary classes, control objects, boundary objects, control objects, timer objects, and other type of objects. And then we use the sequence diagram and communication diagram to model the interaction between these systems. So we have in stateless interaction model a control objects or coordinator objects. The same thing here in state dependent interaction model. We have also the control objects, but in state dependent interaction model we have at least one dependent control object. We have at least one dependent control object, and these control objects execute an state machine or state charts that we learned in the previous class. So in state dependence, or what's the difference between the state dependence and stateless dependence, it's that in state dependence we have at least one dependence control object. Also the execution of the state machine, also these state dependent execute one state machine. So we learned in the previous class how to model the state machine or how to model the state chart. So today we will just combining the interaction model with state chart model. So, since we say the main difference between the state dependence and stateless dependence interaction model is the state dependence object. We should have at least one state dependence object in state dependence model. So what's the state dependence object? So the state dependent object, actually it's first is the control object. Control object, since we say is dependent, that means there is some action is based on this. There is some this object is based on some actions, some situations. So he's not independent, but it's dependent on other objects. So the behavior of this is not only based on the input of the user, but also based on the current situation of the system. Okay, so the first was the state dependent object is actually the control object, but this object is not only uh, depends on the input of the user, but also based on the current situation of the system. So another thing, the state dependent control object receive the income events that cause the state transition. So here the second, if you see in the previous slide, we say also it's these dependents, it's execute a state machine. So here, once this object receive the income event from the income event, so these income events it's cause a transition, and this transition it's cause to execute a state chart or state machine. As I said, in the model should have at least one state dependent object. However, a complex system can have more than one dependent object. Then each dependent object or each state dependent object should associated with a state chart model. So if we come now to the step of developing the state dependent interaction model. So here the step of modeling the interaction dependent state dependent interaction model. As usual, we should first to determine the objects. So here we have different tab in the object or different tab of objects. So here we should to start determine the boundary objects, the state dependence control objects, and other tab of objects. And then we determine the object interaction in the main sequence scenario. Okay, in your use case, you have the main sequence. So now based on this uh, main sequence, we develop the interaction between them, the interaction model. After that, we develop the execution state machine or execution state chart. So since, as we say, we the state dependence at least have one state dependence. So this is the state dependence we should to determine, and then after we determine the sequence of the our system, we come to determine the execution of the state machine. So this state dependence should execute one state machine. So we should also determine the state machine or state chart. So at the end, we check if there is another alternative sequence scenario. So we can summarize now our step to first determine the objects. Determine the objects, boundary object, dependence object, and other object. And then determine the sequence of the program of the system. And then determine the execution of the state machine or state chart. And finally, check in your use case if there is another alternative sequence scenario. So if there is another sequence scenario, you determine the state machine and state dependent based on this alternative scenario. Now you can imagine with me, we have two diagrams. The first is the sequence or communication diagram. On the other side, we have the state machine diagrams. So there is an interaction between these two, between the sequence diagram or the interaction diagram, which is represent the interaction model and the state chart or state machine. So how these interaction happen? So first, actually, the state dependence control object in state in a dependence diagram or independence in the state dependence model receive an event from another object, which is the source. Okay, so the arrival of these input events cause a transition. That means there is something will happen in the other side, which is in the state machine. There is a transition will happen on the other side, and after this transition is completed, the state dependence will receive this output, and then the effect of the state transition, it will be one or more uh, output event. So this event will be sent to the state dependence control objects, and state control objects will send this to each output events in the interaction model or in the state interaction model. So again, as we say, we have two state or two parts. The first part is the interaction model or state dependent interaction model. The second is the state chart or the state machine. So the state dependence first, when in the state dependence, the state dependence control object receive the input or receive an event from another object, and this object will cause transition on the other side, which is in the state machine, and then this event will cause also will result some events, and this event will send to the state dependence control object, and the state dependence control object in the state dependence model will send this event or this result to the destination, to another object in the state dependence interaction model. So let's see now an example, which is the microwave oven system. We come to the end. Thank you for listening. See you next Monday.